Okay, so this is a discussion, or you guys ask questions. But this is my attempt at doing water. It's a little bit specialized because it's mostly to do with these sort of ships. So I think the techniques that I'm going to say here work very well with 1/700 scale, which is like this, or 1/350 scale, and for waterline ships. It does have uses for other things, so I brought these in. This is an old model I did years ago, and so there's a puddle I made, and this uses the same technique. And this is a base I made recently where it's just a little bit of water, but it's using kind of the same techniques. And what I mean by that is the main thing I'm using is acrylics. So if you've seen like the big ponds with a tank stuck in it, that's usually a resin, a clear epoxy resin that you can tint, and that's a totally different thing. I've only played with that a little bit. I'll tell you the main difference between those two is one is this is sort of slow and painstaking for small things at a time. The resin, you can make a big block pretty quickly. The other thing about the resin is it will not shrink. From what I understand, when you pour it, the level it's at is the level it's going to be at, and it's just curing will give you that shape. Whereas this, you'll get shrinkage. So I think if you do like a 35th scale tank, where you want to make a river or a pond, or you want to put a 48th scale plane in the water, that's going to be something where you want to use the resin. That's got its tricks in the trade, which I don't know that well. So what we're going to talk about today is using acrylic-based systems to make water. And so I think the main advantage with the acrylics is it looks wet. And I think that's the main thing you want with water. If you just paint with just straight paints, it never really looks that effective, I think. So you'll see people will just paint a base blue and a little bit of white on the high spots, and it just never looks right. I think if you want to make it look like water, this is the stuff to do it. And so I've got sort of 3 examples of it here, and they all have their different uses and issues. One is a self-leveling gel. This is a regular gel, and this is a heavy gel. And so these are all available from any good artist store. They're not cheap. I think they're about $10 a piece, but they're always on sale. So if you go to Curry's, or I've got these at Bijan's, they usually have a sale on for acrylic gels at some point. And you can, if you want to go big, there's bigger ones for cheaper. But it's not cheap, but it's actually not too bad either.
Just don't go to Michael's.
Well, and the other thing is, it's especially not cheap if you leave the lid off for a while, because then you'll get a solid block that you paid $10 for and only use once. So make sure you keep the lid on tight. And so what is the difference between these? And I'll just show you something. So I did this on the weekend. So these are 3 spots that I did, and I tried to make exactly the same size of gel on each. So this is the self-leveling gel, this is the regular gel, and this is the heavy gel. So sort of the 3 things that you can take out of this is that the self-leveling one has gone clear. And that looks like a puddle of water right now. Whereas the regular gel and the heavy gel, more the heavy gel, you'll get this opaque look to it. And that has its advantages and disadvantages. And I think all it is it'll dry. All it is drying out. And when it goes dry, there's no more water in it. It's crystal clear. But I think what happens if you go thick, and I mean by thick as in just a blob of it, that the outside is drying to the point where the inside can't dry, and so it's never going to be clear. So if you wanted to make it clear, and using this heavy set stuff, you've got 2 choices, and I'll talk about the second one in a minute. The one is to build it up slowly over time. And so the way I do it, so there's a couple tricks to it, so I'll just use the regular gel for now. And so it comes, you can see this is still moist. Now this one is like several years old, and as long as you keep it tight, it's going to be fine. if you open it up and it's looking pretty clear inside and this won't go in, you probably have to buy some new ones. So one thing people will try to do is use a brush. I find a brush never works because I can never get rid of the brush strokes. So I bought again from like these are from Bijon's. You could use some plastic or something like that, but you want to have it so that there's no serrations on it or anything that'll give you lines. So I've actually had a couple of wooden ones that are curved and things like that. That's kind of nice, but I'll do something like that. So I'll take a little bit, and this I'm just building up what I have, and the tricky part is trying to make it look realistic. So this is just, you can see actually where I've done things here, where like there you can see where I've scraped it, and that's never going to look like water. So usually I'm just going over it and over it again with thinner layers than this, just to, you can sort of cover up that mistake by adding more later.
Should you paint your base first?
Yeah, so that's the two choices you have, and that goes back to this point. So when I'm doing things like this one, is the base was painted, and actually I can pop this on and off. Actually, I'm going to leave it for a bit, but if you can see it up close here, what I've done is I've airbrushed around the base of the boat a lighter green with a bit of white. So I put a bit of white down and a little bit of green closer to it, and that gives the idea of the disturbed water around the ship. And that was on the base before I put the gloss on. And this is the self-leveling, and I've just put it over and just sort of creased it to try and make it look a little bit this way, and then gone the other direction for the water back here. And so this one still needs a little bit of adding to it, but that's painting the base before you add the water. And it's with the self-leveling stuff, it's thin enough that it's going to dry clear, so you see what's underneath, and it looks quite good. If you're going to do this, you can see the problem here. So it's actually, the opaque can look pretty good because high spots may look opaque, which would be good, but a lot of times it just doesn't look right. So I would recommend that especially if you're doing heavy swells, you're going to be painting afterwards to get the three-dimensional side to it, and then probably go over with some self-leveling or even acrylic, future. This, I think, is essentially this stuff, except really thin. They're both acrylic. And to get you the gloss back. And so, for example, this is something I did, again, on Sunday night, is I took a bit of the heavy gloss gel. So if you look up close on these guys, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, I kind of put a peak on all of these. And so in the big one, you can still see a little bit of a peak, but it settles. The regular stuff settles, and certainly the self-leveling stuff settles flat. This one, you can still see there's sharp bits to it. And actually they can be quite tall and thin, like that last one here, and that's because of the heavy gel. And they're never going to dry out, and so I don't think that would ever look realistic. Something like that might, in the end, look realistic with a bit of the opaque. So what I've done here is essentially doing the same thing, and I'll show you with the heavy gel. If you want to do something like, this is supposed to give the idea of like if you wanted to make, a really like, a heavy wind or something like that. That was the idea behind those waves. So there you would take the heavy gel, and then you just kind of build it up. It's actually pretty easy. I'll do a bit more. Yeah, quite a bit more. So you can see you can do things like that to try and get sort of the wind-swept, thin water coming off the top. Now, that is never, the best you're going to hope for is you're going to get that opaque color. So what I've done here is then I've gone over and spray painted it, and I've used a gray-green here. I'll talk about color in a bit. And that, it still holds its shape quite well, so it looks nice and thin. But the hard part here is actually going over it afterwards, and then you're going to have to make that glossy again. And you can do it, so this I put a really thin gloss varnish on top. Probably a little bit better would be to either use straight acrylic or maybe even try to get a thin layer of this on top of it to make that look a little more glossy, because I think that's the one clear point is you need gloss. But that gets you a little bit more of the 3-dimension. And as I said, this stuff will never, I don't think it'll ever go clear again. But if you want to make just water like a fairly calm sea, the self-leveling stuff is great. It may take a day or two to get crystal clear, but it'll go crystal clear on you.
How long to dry?
The self-leveling, probably 1 to 2 days. Yeah, I put this is like years old, and I bet you I could still drive a fingernail in it. So it's never going to be as hard as like that epoxy resin, but it still holds its shape. I think you could scarf this up, whereas I don't think you could scarf up the epoxy resin. So I'll talk a bit about color. You'll see guys paint water blue. I've never seen water look blue. I've always used, what I really have always liked is that color there, at least for blue water ocean or deep ocean. I think most people have really kind of gravitated to using the Tamiya Sea Blue. And it's nowhere near blue. It's like I think what they're saying is blue water ocean, and it's almost like a dark, dark, deep green. But I think that's, at least in my mind, that's about as good as you can get for sea color. So this is the Model Air Dark Sea Blue, and that's the color there. I think maybe if you got in the right area of the Pacific or something, that might look real, but to me it just doesn't look, it looks not natural. Now you see a lot of British modelers, I think they're used to the English Channel, or at least looking at ports, and invariably, and this is my attempt at copying it, it's like this ugly gray green. It's almost like some sort of weird pea soup. But apparently that's probably the color of what it looks like. So this was, I put the Tamiya first on this, but then I was just using that to cover it up. But you could probably make that more gray-green. But so there are lots of options. The one that I don't think is real is blue. I don't think, maybe that's a reflection of the sky when you see it, but real water is a very bunch of different combinations. Shallow water or disturbed water would probably look more gray-green. A puddle like this I tinted with brown for obvious reasons. But if you want deep water ocean, this is the guy I think that to me looks the best. So some of the things that will go wrong, you see over time, there's areas of this one I did where it's dried and it's become flat. And that's usually I have like 3 or 4 layers that I build it up, and by the time you're done, the 3rd or 4th layer, those will all be gone. If they're not, good old Future, just paint it on. Future's kind of nice because you can quickly do it with a brush, and it doesn't hold the brush strokes, so you can clean things up a little bit. And that's what I use that for. So here are the other colors that I've used. So I like to use now, as I started using this Vallejo primers that come in different colors. So I actually started using the black rather than the old-fashioned white or gray primers, because I think it gives it a little bit more oomph when you're going over it, and you can kind of get a better idea of the water. And the where it's clearer will be darker, which is I think what you would see in a normal ocean. So what do I use for bases? So my preference is wood, just because I really like wood. So this is one I'm preparing. It's for another submarine, so this one's a little bit big for it. But this is just a piece of oak I bought at Rona, and I just cut it to shape. And when I first started doing this, I had real trouble with the acrylic gel. It still looks good, but I kept finding the wood would absorb more and more of it, and you kind of get wood imprint or holes through it. It was really hard to do. And so what I do now is I have and I used to use linseed oil and things like that, but it didn't fill the gaps. So now I use, had its first layer of polyurethane resin, And I actually do about 4 or 5 layers, and that hopefully plugs all the holes and makes it a more solid base. Then I tape around the edges like that, because I kind of like the natural wood, and then do all my base making on top of that. Often a little bit will leak through if I didn't mask all that well, but you can sand that down and kind of make it look a little better after the fact. It does create its problems though. I think it looks really nice with the wood after the fact, but it is hard to deal with. This is just straight plastic card that I got to do this demo, but I think if you wanted to do like if you got some plastic or something hard or impervious, it would make things a lot easier to start with. This I'd probably have to do more layers certainly than this, just because you've got to start dealing with the wood itself. So if you had like a piece of plastic or something you wanted to use as a base, something that's going to absorb nothing, it would make life a little easier.
Now, when do you mount the boat and how?
So most of the time, so this is just a demo, so this guy isn't really part of it. Usually what I do is I try and get the model at least largely complete, and then actually mounting the ship in the water, that's just stuck into the acrylic gel. Once it goes into the acrylic gel, it's not coming back out. So this, I did my first layer, painted it, and then did a really thin layer, and then just stuck it in there, and that's going nowhere. And so I think if you did something maybe 350 size, you might want to do some more adhering to it. But certainly for anything small like that, the resin itself, I've never had any problem. It's pretty well like a rock once it's in there. And then the trouble is trying to make sure you don't get any of the paint or subsequent layers on the ship itself. So you've got to work around it. That's kind of what I've done here. So I'm going to peel this guy off for now. So this is something, so a few people that have seen me talk about this before, there's sometimes things aren't new, but this is the one thing that I've started doing recently that I really kind of like, and this is not my doing. You can see a lot of the guys trying to do this now. And I always had trouble with the wake. You can build up the wake with some of the heavy gel and things like that, and trying to get it right is hard, and it doesn't look as well. I think this actually looks better. So that's going to go there, and this is showing the disturbed water afterwards. And what I've used, and so I'm going to try and demo a little bit of it on here for this one, is I've used cotton. And I think it's got a couple of advantages so far that I can see that I really like about it. One is that it's much finer, and you can get what looks like finer spray. There's no way, so using heavy gel, you can see kind of like fine points on it. So you can get reasonably looking stuff, but it's not as fine as what a real ship would look like. So I'm just going to put this guy on here, just to basically say what I do now. So I think that what a number of people, and this is coming primarily from a guy in Alberta, Chris Floodberg, who is like, I would suggest, one of the top 3 guys on the planet for doing this sort of thing. He's actually a real artist as well as doing this, so he's got a real sense of things. But what I do is I use this. So if you just see, if you pull it out, you can see these sort of thin strands. And that's what you're looking for, is that is kind of like fine enough that it does look like water spray. People have used other things. Some people will rip Kleenex and use the ripped edge as like the water. I haven't tried that, but I've seen people that make it look good. So what I do is I pull off a little bit of this stuff. This works very well. So most of what I've seen, that Chris Floodberg's got a YouTube video from essentially the same kind of demo that he did for IPMS, I think it was Calgary. And there he's using, it's a 350 scale battleship he was doing. So he was using cotton balls to get more of a shape. So this is going to be a little harder to see. But I get a little piece, I kind of roll it a little bit to get thickness. And then I'll lean it up against the side, get it in approximately the right place. And then I'll just use a small brush. So I'm just going to try and put this in towards the ship. Bat it down a little bit. You kind of know the shape you're going after. And that's going to live a little bit more. But the thing I like about it is even if you ball it up like that, there's still little bits of variation to it that it makes it look more like water. And if you get little strands loose, you can just sort of like pat them down with the future, and you'll get really thin lines. And if you ever look at a ship's wake, it does sort of look like a spider web a little bit. And so I think, here I would say that, again, it all depends on what you want. If you want to make a ship, fast-moving ship, you're going to build it up even more. I think that one needs a little bit more. I'm doing this quickly just for time, but I kind of enjoy it because you can sit there and there's like kind of like a double thing going on. And so if you take a look, I think that looks much more wake-like than you could ever do with the gel or with paint or anything like that. And you can take really thin stuff.
Easy to get rid of if you don't like the look on the stuff.
Yeah, it's easy to get rid of, but you got to make your decisions really quick. You've got a fair bit of time to work with it when it's like this, but once that acrylic dries, it's done. You're not getting it back off. And again, the back of the ship, there's always these little whirly-gigs things going on back there. And if you tried to paint the fine, you'd never be able to paint the fineness of those lines. Actually, I should go back the other way. Also, the one thing I've found is so often you'll see in ships, there'll be like these periodic high points coming off the ship, depending on how fast the ship is going, the roughness of the sea, but there'll be like these nice curved lines coming off. And they go out, here it's short, get longer and longer as they go out. You can do that with this as well, or you could do that with the acrylic gel and build that up. The one thing I would do is plan that out ahead of time, and usually what I have is some sort of reference picture from a ship to kind of guide what I'm doing, because I find, my imagination is never quite what it seems. But if you take pictures from a real ship and you try and copy it, it usually comes off much better. So I'm just trying to get the thicker part around to the front here. That's a little bit too much there, but I would make that actually a little bit thinner if I was going to do this for real. And then you just keep working it, and you'll see little bits like, okay, here's a little piece sticking up. You just hit that with the acrylic and that, or the future, and that'll knock it down. So started, and it also looks a little more, once you get it down, it looks a little more opaque than the stuff around it. It still looks wet because of the acrylic, but I think that actually helps in the realism. There's a few flaky ones floating around, so usually I get those out with a tweezer after it's dried. And we're sticking out a little bit up here, so I'll just beat that down a little bit more. Yeah, there's a lot of loose ones there to clean up. But that's the kind of thing I think if you see the, and especially when it dries, you'll still see the white there, and that I think looks a little bit more, I don't think you can see that, a little bit more realistic as far as you would never be able to paint anything that fine. If you see this one, you know, there's what it looks like when it is dried, so the whiteness will come back once it dries. And, you know, there's one of those things coming off. And quite fine little white lines, which I think makes it look more realistic. And here you get the idea of spray as well, which is what you're going to see at the front of the ship. And so that's one thing I've been playing with a lot lately, and I do think it's going to be a better wake, and some of the water effects are going to be a lot nicer than what I've done in the past with just gel. And again, I would use like ship pictures or whatever to guide, like how big do I want to make it, how far apart these things are going to be, just based on how fast it is. But you know, how far out to make these, and you know, how far back to make the disturbed water. It's easier just to guide yourself with pictures than use your imagination.
No, the angle of your boats, they're all askew.
Yeah,
Personal choice?
Yeah, I think it's having a parallel. You know, unless it's in port or something, I would put a parallel. But in open water, I put it more on an angle because I think it creates the illusion of movement more.
Another advantage of the pictures is that every hull has a different configuration. So different types of ships give different wakes. Yeah, I've got a book at home that shows how to do them. I keep forgetting to consult it.
But anyway, those are the main things to try if you want to try it. I said that the heavier the water, the more difficult it gets. If you want to make really heavy stuff, like I was like the submarine that Anthony put up, that's a guy that's a real master at it. And certainly you'd never try that with just the gel. You would build up some sort of three-dimensional sculpture. I know some people use like styrofoam and then seal it, or epoxy sculpt or something. Jim Bauman, who does really nice subtle wave effects on his, he uses artist paper that he cuts out the shape of the ship and then builds up curves just based on using paper. And it's just the artist paper that you get at Curry's or whatever.
Sort of onion skin? Is it like
yeah, or like
transparent?
no, it's the thicker stuff. Almost like
Like the watercolor paper?
Yeah, watercolor paper.
okay, so it's a
He gets
heavier-
thicker watercolor paper, and then once you put that down, and he puts, I forget what he uses to solidify it, and then you start going in with this stuff to get you the 3-dimension, because as I said, building it up would just be so many layers, it'd be painful.
Yeah.
The one thing is especially, you know, for 350 scale, it may be something you want to do more of. For 700 scale, if you got, you know, that's a heavy sea would be, you know, yeah, not very big. Like if you know, a 30-foot wave or something like that is pretty rare. But, you know, I've got a dog boat, which is, I think that would look really cool if you had it in heavy seas doing something. And that's probably something where you want to build it up with something else before you start doing this. But you know, overall, I think for much of the water effects, the acrylic gel, especially for waterline ships, is really hard to beat. It's something to try if you want to do small bits of water for a figure or a base like this. But if you want to do the big stuff, you probably want to do the epoxy resin. And again, that's something that I don't have a lot of familiarity with, but I don't think it's necessary for anything like this, and I think it actually would be harder work. I've also heard that if you don't cure it right, you can actually, if you try and embed a ship in it, it'll actually warp the hull a little bit from the heat or something. But this, you don't have to worry about it. The other thing that's really nice about this is it's water cleanup. As far as I'm aware, I haven't tried to eat it yet, but it's, I don't think it's overly toxic. And if you do want to tint, it does actually work quite well. And you certainly don't need very much. If you mix in just straight acrylic paints, matches the acrylic gel, and you whip it up and it works really well. I try to do some things like when I'm playing with this, if a straight piece of anything will pull hard on this, so I'll wet it as I try to move it, and that tends to get rid of some of the lines.
Do you ever have problems with air trapped in it?
Yeah, and I think what I've done is where I've run into that is if I'm really aggressive, and when I was doing it with a brush, I think the water mixing in with it, I mean, it's perfectly miscible with water. But I think if you try and do too much mixing, I think a lot of those air droplets form are actually probably water droplets, and that's what causes a lot of the issues. So what I've started doing now is I will actually just use water on top to essentially to prevent any harsh lines which don't look real, and I get very much fewer. With this stuff, if you're aggressive with the self-leveling stuff, you'll start to see it. So I have a little like pin that I start going in and trying to get rid of them. And
Tip of a scriber.
and if I've had it where there's a lot of bubbles in there, and that's when it's convenient just to paint over and do another thin layer, because then they go away.
What about a hairdryer?
So I've heard that for the resin, it's a bigger problem, especially because once it sets, you're done. And I've heard heating that gets them to rise. I haven't noticed anything with this. I find it just easier just to pick them out as fast as you can. But if you just put on like layer after layer, thin layer with the self-leveling or something, I don't notice it that much. It's just if you're bashing it about a lot with water, I think that starts to where you start to see more of them. But it's correctable. Okay?
Awesome. Well,
So
thank you, Tom.
Any more questions or whatever?
One more.
Yep.
700 scale carriers. You're kind of looking at this size here. Will this still work with that, or are you starting?
Oh,
with that
absolutely.
resin? Okay.
Yeah, no. So the guys the really good guys that do the 350 scale, so you're doing there, they do it with the acrylic gel.
Really?
You can actually see there's kind of a, especially with the Tamiya blue, you can kind of like if you look at on Steel Navy or model warships, you'll see the guys that are doing it. It'll all have that kind of effect that you'll see. And I think that's because they're all using the acrylic gel. Depending on, if they may be building it up before they put that on. There may be ways that you could actually do like a hard sculpt with something hard and then paint, but then you probably want to put, if you may be able to get the same kind of effects with a clear varnish over top. But I think a lot of the reason you get this effect is because it is a little bit of transparency to it. Nothing that you can really point your finger at, but it does have a little bit of that transparency that I think makes it look like water, and I think that's why people use it. As I said, if you really want transparent water, like a pond or something, that's when you get into the resin. So, you can see rocks on the bottom or something like that. But ocean, you want a little bit of transparency, but actually if you look at the side of a ship, like on open water, you can only see the hull maybe a foot below the water line, and then it's gone. And so I think that's where, this stuff has got the advantage. Okay?
Well, let's give Tom a hand for
Thank you.